Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Office Hours Politics Edition. I'm your host, Ziana Aly, and today I want to have a conversation that's a little different, a little heavier, and a little closer to the skin. This episode is called The Politics of Being Muslim. And to be honest with you, it has probably been the hardest one I've ever had to record. Not because I don't know what to say, but because I do. I've redone this episode at least 5 times. Truly not because I wasn't ready, but because I was a little scared. I've recently learned that the most controversial thing I could say out loud is something good about Islam, and that somehow that's the most threatening thing. Let's start at the beginning. Not the beginning of Islam, but the beginning of how Islam came to be seen in the way it is, in the Western imagination of it all. Because to understand the politics of being Muslim today, you need to understand the stories that have been told about us. Not by us, but about us. And you need to understand why these stories were told in the first place. The thinker, Edward Said, who wrote a book called Orientalism in 1978. And in this book, he makes a powerful argument that the Orient is not misunderstood by the West. It was invented by the West, fabricated, shaped, defined. Not because Europeans were curious, but because they were in power. Said says that Western nations, especially during the height of their empires, created an idea of the East, of the Muslim world, that made it seem irrational and dangerous. But why? Glad you asked. Because that idea served a purpose. It made conquest seem like rescue. It made occupation seem like education. And it made Islam seem like a problem that needed fixing. The Orient was never just a location, it was a metaphor, a contrast, a shadow, something the West could point to and say, we're not that. We're civilized, we're rational, we're progressive. And the Muslims, they're not. So when people today casually throw around phrases like the Muslim world, or when they talk about Islamic countries as if they're one big identical mass, they're tapping in to that colonial imaginary, that inherent idea that Muslims are somehow frozen in time, incapable of change, inherently dangerous, or backwards. They don't realize it, but they're recycling 19th century propaganda dressed up in the 21st century language. It's in textbooks, it's in political speeches, it's in movies, news headlines, classroom discussions. Islam isn't described, it's framed. And the frame is already cracked before we even step into the view. I've seen it firsthand in classrooms. People speak with such confidence about things they've never studied or don't know. They use terms like Sharia law as if it's a single, universally applied code of oppression. They refer to Muslim countries without acknowledging the diversity of interpretations, cultures, and history that exist across more than 50 countries. And they never do this with other religions. But Islam, it's fair game. And what Said said helps us understand that this isn't about misinformation, it's about power. The West had to create this image of dangerous Muslims in order to justify violence it inflicted on Muslim populations. The imaginary Muslim threat made real-world military occupation palatable, and it still does. Think about it. What's the dominant image of Muslims in Western media? We're terrorists, oppressors, victims, veiled, explosive, screaming, always extreme, rarely human. But here's the thing, and this is what Said really drives home. These images weren't created to reflect reality. They were created to manage it, to make Western audiences feel morally justified. And that's what makes it so hard to challenge them. Because when you try to offer a different view of Islam, one that's rich, layered, peaceful, intellectual. It doesn't just surprise people, it threatens their entire framework. And for us Muslims, we have to live inside that framework. We have to speak through it, around it, over it. We have to justify our own existence in spaces that have already decided what we are. So when I say the West constructed the Muslim as the other, I'm not just talking about the past, I'm talking about now. I'm talking about how every conversation about Muslims in mainstream spaces begin with suspicion, begin with violence, begin with the assumption that we have something to prove. The point of this is to expose the lens that still distorts how we are seen, because that distortion has consequences. It shapes laws, it justifies surveillance, it puts our names on no-fly lists, it makes our faith something that we have to apologize for. The irony is we are constantly told to explain Islam, but we're rarely asked to explain Orientalism. We are rarely asked to unpack the systems that made this misrepresentation so effective, so enduring, so invisible. So let's flip the question around. Instead of always asking, why are Muslims like this? Maybe we should start asking, why does the West need Muslims to be like this? Who benefits from this fear? Who profits from this framing? Because until we name the machinery behind the image, we'll keep arguing about the reflection in a broken mirror. Moving on to colonialism, not just in the textbook sense, where maps are redrawn, borders imposed, flags planted. I mean, colonialism in the deeper sense, because colonizers didn't just take land, they took language, they took institutions, they took culture, and perhaps most dangerously, they took narrative. See, when colonial powers invaded Muslim majority regions, from India to Algeria to Sudan, they didn't just bring guns, they brought ideology, an entire worldview that said, we are here to save you from yourselves. And the salvation was always framed in terms of progress. The British in India claimed that they were bringing law and order. The French in North Africa said that they were liberating women. Americans in Iraq said that they were delivering democracy. But these claims were not neutral, they were strategic. They are how violence was moralized. Let's take a concrete example. Algeria under French rule. France didn't just occupy Algeria, it waged a psychological war on Algerian identity. Schools that once taught Arabic and Islamic knowledge were shut down or replaced. French became the language of power, and one of the most symbolic and disturbing acts of the colonial state was the public unveiling of Muslim women. French officials would organize ceremonies where Algerian women were pressured to remove their hijabs in front of audiences. This wasn't about freedom, it was about control. The message was, we now own your body, your dignity, and your story. Because for colonial regimes, the veiled Muslim was not just a person, she was a symbol, a justification. Her veil became proof that Islam was oppressive and that France was benevolent. And if she resisted, that was proof of her ignorance, her failure to recognize her own liberation. But here's what that narrative erased: choice, history, complexity. The fact that Muslim women had been scholars, business leaders, commanders long before European women had legal personhood, that Islam, as practiced by generations, contained diverse views on gender, many of which were radically empowering. None of that mattered to the colonizer, because the truth was never the goal, domination was. And if the facts got in the way of the mission, they were rewritten. In British India, similar strategies were used. Islamic courts were dismantled, charitable institutions that were embedded in Islamic society were undermined. Over time, Muslims were portrayed as too dangerous, too backwards to govern themselves. This wasn't accidental, it was surgical. Colonial and they could replace Islam not with Christianity or Western ideals, but with dependence. And the thing is, many of these colonial institutions still shape our world today. The borders we inherit, drawn by colonizers. The constitutions in many Muslim majority countries, modeled on European systems. The schooling systems that devalued past knowledge, still in place. The global economy that rewards extraction and punishes resistance, built during empire. So when people today ask, why are Muslim countries like this? They're often looking at symptoms of trauma that were never healed. And worse, they're judging a scar without ever asking who held the knife. This matters deeply because colonialism didn't just silence Muslims for centuries, it created a vacuum. And when Muslim thinkers tried to resist or rebuild, they were often labeled as extremists. When they tried to preserve their heritage, they were seen as unmodern. When they tried to revive spiritual or political autonomy, they were crushed. And that's the part that gets to me. How often Muslims are blamed for conditions they didn't choose, systems they didn't build, and crises they didn't cause, but are expected to solve, explain, and apologize for. That's why the narrative matters. Because if colonialism was just about taking land, it would have ended when borders changed. But it didn't. It lingered in minds, in policies, in the very way the world speaks about Islam. Even now, in classrooms, newsrooms, parliaments, you can still hear the echoes of that imperial voice. We must reform Islam. We must rescue Muslim women. We must civilize the East. The language is softer now, maybe more progressive, more liberal, but the power underneath, it's still the same. So when I say colonialism took more than land, I mean it stole the story of who we are and replaced it with something shallow, something suspicious, and something broken. But here's the thing. Stories can be reclaimed, and that's why this episode matters. Because part of decolonizing Islam isn't about books or protests, it's about voice, it's about narrative, it's about saying, we remember who we are, we remember what was taken, we refuse to be explained by our colonizers ever again. So far, we talked about how Islam has been constructed from the outside, how the West has historically framed Muslims as threats, how colonialism didn't just take land, it took over the narrative. But what happens when the narrative becomes internalized? When the colonizers no longer need to speak, because we've learned to speak their language against ourselves. This is where things get hard. Because the truth is, the empire doesn't just live out there, it lives in us. There is this idea called black skin, white masks, where colonized people internalize it. Colonization and the aftershock of it leaves us with this idea of we want to be accepted by the colonizers. The colonized has to mimic, to perform, to erase. And that's because it has been so largely embedded that we're less than, that we need it safe, that we can't govern ourselves, we're not educated, we're backwards, we're anti-democracy, we're all of these horrible, ugly things, and the West came in to save us, and we want to be like them. And I see it. I see it in everyday Muslim communities. I see it in the way we talk about ourselves, the way we police each other, the way we try to prove that we're not those Muslims. And it's all around where we tell our kids not to speak Arabic so loudly in public. We avoid praying in airports. We tell ourselves we can't be so loud about Palestine. We smile a little extra at border control. That's what I mean by self-policing. It's not that someone told us to behave, it's that we've learned deeply over time that certain parts of our identity are seen as dangerous. So we shrink them before they're questioned. After 9/11, this became survival. Suddenly, every Muslim in the West was expected to become a PR rep, a spokesperson. We had to condemn terrorism on demand. We had to explain Sharia law to people who had never read a page of Islamic history. We had to answer for actions of people we never met. We who didn't speak for us, who somehow defined us. Your presence was political. And that's the trick of self-policing. It offers no safety, only silence. And this isn't just an individual problem, it's structural. Schools reward students who can adopt a certain tone, one that's critical of Islam. Media platforms elevate Muslims who are willing to critique their own community, but rarely those who challenge Western power. Governments welcome good Muslims, the ones who condemn, who apologize, who assimilate, but exclude those who resist, who organize, and who remember. So what do? We start by noticing it, by recognizing that voice in our heads that tell us to be small, to play it safe, to stay quiet. We start by acknowledging that shame is not a moral compass, it's a colonial inheritance. We start by reclaiming the parts of ourselves that we were taught to hide. Because the truth is, the most powerful thing we can do is speak. And maybe that's the most radical act of all, to be visible, to be Muslim without explanation. Because when the empire lives inside us, resistance can start with looking in the goddamn mirror. Okay, let's talk politics. And specifically, let's talk about Islamic political thought. Because one of the most common and most incorrect assumptions I hear is that Islam is anti-democracy, it's authoritarianism, it's incompatible with modern political life. And of course, the running punchline, if Muslims had it their way, we'd all be living in horrid Sharia law. Everyone would be having no rights, women would have no rights. Let me be blunt, that's just not accurate. And to be real, it's intellectually lazy. And it says a lot more about the fear of that person, of the person speaking, than it does about the actual tradition they're misrepresenting. Let's start with what Islamic political thought actually is. Islam doesn't draw a hard line between religion and politics the way Western liberalism does. In fact, its entire framework of Western secularism, what's often called separation of church and state, isn't a universal value. It's a historical development rooted in European conflicts between monarchy and church power. Islam developed differently. The Quran wasn't just a spiritual text, it was also a social document. It included rules about trade, inheritance, marriage, conflict resolution, governance, and public ethics. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, wasn't just a preacher. He was a statesman, a negotiator, a judge. The first Muslim community in Medina was built on a constitution. It laid out the rights and responsibilities of various religious groups, including Muslims, Jews, and pagans. It was pluralistic, and in many ways, radical. So when we talk about Islamic political thought, we're not talking about dictatorship wrapped in scripture. We're talking about a system that has historically emphasized ethics, accountability, and justice as central to governance. One of the key concepts in Islamic politics is this idea of consultation, that leaders are expected to consult the people, not just every 4 years with a ballot, but an ongoing collective process. That idea is not authoritarianism. It's participatory governance grounded in moral responsibility. Another key idea is public good. Policies and decisions should be judged by how well they protect the essential values in Islamic law: life, religion, intellect, lineage, and prosperity. That's not abstract. That's about preserving dignity, and redistributing resources fairly. And then there is zakat, one of the five pillars of Islam, often translated as charity, but that doesn't do it justice. Zakat is a required redistribution of wealth. It's institutional, structured. It says a portion of your earnings doesn't belong to you, it belongs to those who are struggling. It's not optional, it's a right of the poor over the wealthy. Okay, so if you're listening to this and you're thinking, isn't this all theocracy? Here's the difference. In a theocracy, religious leaders hold absolute political power, often without accountability. In Islamic political thought, at least how it's originally imagined, no one is above the law. Now, does this mean that every Muslim majority country today follows these principles? Absolutely not. In fact, many regimes that claim to be Islamic blatantly violates these values. They use Islamic language to justify monarchy, patriarchy, violence, and repression. And many of them are backed by Western military and economic alliances. That contradiction matters. Because when people say Islam and democracy don't go together, they're often pointing to governments, not the religion itself. That's like judging Christianity based on fascist regimes, or judging democracy based on colonial genocide. It's not honest. It's not fair. The truth is, Islamic political thought offers something profoundly relevant for today's world: a vision of politics as inherently ethical, not neutral, not amoral. It's not about who wins elections or passes legislation. It's about what kind of society we're trying to build. And in that time when capitalism commodifies everything, when politics is performative, when human life is often treated as disposable, Islamic ethics remind us that power is a trust, that wealth is a responsibility, that leadership is a burden, not a right. And maybe that's what really scares people. Not Sharia law, but the idea that politics should actually be accountable to something higher than profit, higher than ego, higher than empire. So when I say Islamic politics isn't theocracy, I'm not trying to make it palatable. I'm saying it's something deeper. It's a moral framework that demands justice from top down, bottom up. It doesn't separate the soul from the system. It insists that every policy should be rooted in care. And in a world drowning in cynicism, that's not something to fear. That's something to learn from. Let's get personal again. Because if we're talking about the politics of being Muslim, we have to talk about what it means to be a Muslim woman. And it's not just because I happen to be one, but because the figure of the Muslim woman has always been a site of political struggle, a battleground, a symbol, but rarely ever a person. From colonial conquest to modern liberation campaigns, Muslim women have been talked about, legislated over, photographed, debated, pitied, and condemned. We have been made hyper-visible and completely invisible at the same time. People see us, but they don't actually look. They speak about us, not to us. It's exhausting and revealing because it shows that people don't see Muslim women as individuals. They see us as metaphors that can be manipulated. In colonial Algeria, French colonizers again staged unveiling ceremonies, public events where Algerian women were liberated by removing their veils. And these ceremonies were photographed, reported, and celebrated in Europe. And this was about domination. And the legacy still continues. Today, women's clothing is politicized, whether it's bans of the hijab in France, to surveillance of niqabi women, or suspicions towards hijabis in American airports. Meanwhile, no one questions Catholic nuns, Orthodox Jewish women. The problem isn't fabric, it's the faith. It's Islam that people can't tolerate, and the Muslim women, especially those who are visibly devout, who bear the brunt of that intolerance. Because we represent a contradiction they can't resolve. If we're covered, they say we're oppressed. If we're outspoken, they say we're brainwashed. If we reject Western feminism, we're traitors to our gender. And if we embrace feminism on our own terms, we're told it's not real unless it mirrors theirs. But here's the truth: Muslim women have been at the forefront of intellectual, political, and spiritual life for centuries. Khadija, the Prophet's first wife, was a wealthy entrepreneur who supported the first Muslim community with her money and her voice. Aisha, one of the most prominent narrators of the Hadith, was a scholar and legal authority who debated men publicly. One of the first universities in the world in Morocco was founded by a Muslim woman. And today, Muslim women continue to lead movements, publish scholarship, run for office, and reinterpret scripture through the lens of equality and justice. And those stories rarely make it to mainstream discourse because they complicate the narrative. They show that Islam isn't inherently misogynistic, that Muslim women aren't passive, that our faith doesn't have to be at odds with our freedom. And that's terrifying to those who built entire careers and campaigns on the idea that Muslim women need saving. Let me be clear. This idea that women are facing oppression, it actually goes against Quranic teachings. In fact, the Quran repeatedly affirms the spiritual equality of men and women. It grants women rights to property, inheritance, consent in marriage, education, and divorce, at a time where many other societies offered women little to nothing. The issue is not Islam, the issue is who gets to interpret it and for what purpose. So when people ask me if I feel oppressed as a Muslim woman, I want to ask them, oppressed by whom? My faith, which affirms my dignity, or by your gaze that just deduces me down to a stereotype? And that's what I think this section is really about. Not just about reclaiming the narrative of a Muslim woman, but dismantling the structures that have always tried to own it. Because we're not metaphors and we're not projects. We are people. Okay, now let's talk about something that makes people uncomfortable: power, and specifically the kind of power that doesn't just dominate through policies or military force, but through profit, through capitalism. Because if we're gonna understand the global suspicion towards Islam and the global violence that often accompanies it, we need to move past religious misunderstandings and start to look at economic strategy. We need to understand that Islam isn't just feared because of its beliefs, it's feared because it poses a challenge to systems of extraction, inequality, and unchecked power. In other words, it's a problem. Let's start with what capitalism requires: growth, constant growth, expansion, commodification. Everything, land, labor, time, even relationships, becomes something that can be bought and sold. Profit isn't just a goal, it's a moral foundation. If something makes money, it's considered good. If it doesn't, it's disposable. Now, think about what that means for the global South. Think about the legacy of colonialism in the Muslim world: borders drawn by empires, resources stripped, local economies destroyed and reconstructed to serve foreign markets. And even after formal independence, the old economic relationships didn't die. They just rebranded through trade deals, debt traps, oil contracts, and development projects that have always seemed to benefit Western corporations more. Let's take Iraq. In the lead up to the 2003 invasion, we were told it was about democracy, about weapons of mass destruction, about freeing people from tyranny. But the aftermath tells a different story: privatization of state assets, redistribution of oil contracts to foreign firms, the imposition of new trade rules favorable to American interests. In short, Iraq became opened for business. Afghanistan, same story. Libya, again. Palestine, the occupation isn't just military, it's economic. It's about land control, water control, border control, and in every case, Islam becomes the excuse. These people are extremists. They don't understand democracy. we're bringing them freedom. But what's really happening is that imperial interests, and they're being cloaked in this language of morality. And Islam, as living and organizing force, gets in the way of that. Why? Because Islam doesn't separate economics from ethics. It doesn't allow wealth to be hoarded. It doesn't let banks profit off endless interests. Interest is forbidden. It mandates charity, not just as a personal gesture, but as an institutional obligation. It requires the redistribution of wealth. It protects the dignity of labor. And it reminds us that this world and everything in it is temporary, that what you own is not what you are. In short, Islam challenges the very heart of neoliberalism. It says your life is not your job, your worth is not your wage, your success is not your salary. It flips the value system. And that's deeply unsettling to a global order built on hierarchy, greed, and accumulation. And it goes deeper. Islam doesn't just critique capitalism, it critiques the empire itself. It speaks from the perspective of the oppressed, not just in charity, but in structure. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born into a society dominated by these elites, a tribal group obsessed with wealth and status. He preached justice, fairness, and accountability, and for that he was threatened, exiled, and attacked. His early followers were slaves, orphans, women, the poor. Islam spread not as a tool of domination, but as a revolt against it. That history matters because it reminds us that Islam isn't just a religion of praying 5 times a day, it's a religion of resistance. And that resistance isn't new, and it didn't start in 2001, and it didn't start with ISIS. It started with empires trying to silence a message that says every soul has worth, every person is accountable, no leader is above the law. So of course the empire fears Islam, not because we're violent but because we're inconvenient. We don't subject easily because we remember our history is older than theirs. Our principles can't be bought. It offers structure. It offers a different way to be in the world. And maybe that's what they really mean when they say we're a threat. Not because we have weapons, but because we have memory. Because we carry within the possibility of another world. Let's bring it home. We've talked about empire, we've talked about capitalism, about colonialism, but sometimes the politics isn't just out there in laws, wars, and textbooks. Sometimes politics are personal. It's internal. It lives in the body, in the voice, in the space you're not allowed to take up. So let me be direct. This is the part of what it feels like to be me, to be a Muslim woman in public, in academic settings, in Western spaces, to move through the world while carrying a tradition that so many people think they already understand and almost always misunderstand. It's exhausting. That's the word of the day for me. It's exhausting to be the only Muslim in the room and to know that everyone's waiting for you to say something, or worse, to not say something. It's exhausting to see your religion constantly dragged into conversations where no other religion would ever be questioned. And it devastates me. Even the way the quote unquote questions are framed, it's not curiosity, it's suspicion dressed up as dialogue. That's the burden of being framed as inherently suspicious by default, by design. I've recorded and deleted episodes. I've changed my tone in writing. I've softened my arguments that didn't need softening, all because I've been conditioned to believe that, again, the most radical and most dangerous thing I could say in public is something good about Islam. Let that sink in. In 2025, saying something loving about my faith feels genuinely like a political risk. But I'm done. I've spent too long watching people debate my identity like it's a case study, watching people flatten Islam into headlines, into hashtags, into policy memos, into talking points. I'm done being an object in someone else's narrative because what they don't see and what they never ask about is the beauty, the depth, the scholarship. If you stayed with me through this whole episode, thank you. Truly, thank you for listening, for questioning, for sitting with ideas that aren't always comfortable, because that's what growth looks like. That's what decolonizing the mind actually means, not just adding new facts to the file cabinet for your brain, but rethinking the cabinet itself. Um, so let's return to the central question. What is it about Islam that feels so threatening to the modern world? Why is it that something deeply rooted in ethics, mercy, balance, and justice is portrayed as a global threat? Here's my answer. After everything we've discussed, Islam is not a threat, it's an alternate. It's an alternate to an empire, to capitalism, to hollow liberalism, to the idea that power has no higher obligation than itself. Islam offers a different method, a different moral architecture. So, this final reflection is not about closure, it's about clarity. I want us to walk away from this episode with our eyes wide open to understand that Islam is not a relic of the past, not a threat to the future, but a living, breathing, evolving source of power in the present, a power rooted not in domination, but in dignity, a power that says every soul is sacred. Okay, that's all I have for you guys today. This has been Office Hours Politics Edition. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and stay politically awake. Bye, guys.